All right, good afternoon. My name is Lauren Kennedy, and I'm the historian of the Sigma Tau chapter of KDP. I would like to welcome you to this important session. Just a few reminders before we begin. Please mute your microphone until the Q&A part of the program. And in addition, sign the sign-in sheet when it's sent out in the chat. With that being said, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Joshua Patterson. He's an assistant professor of education right here at the Mount.
Thank you so very much, Lauren. Lauren's one of my standout students, so it means a lot to have her provide the introduction. I hope everyone's enjoying the conference. I know, I was part of that last session, and so much of it, I think, bleeds over into this. And as Dr. Taylor mentioned, there is definitely this theme of humanizing education. And so what I'd like to concentrate on in my piece is how we can use technology to bridge some of those gaps and try to create a more inclusive conversation for students who may not be as apt to participate in discussions. So I'd like to share my screen with you. We'll get started. This is a 2-hour session. So I'm going to spend the first portion of the session on kind of the nuts and bolts, the theories undergirding this, the methodology, and then the second half will be spent more on the practical application of the methods. So let me get it rolling here. All right. The term that you might see throughout this presentation and in a lot of what I write about is COTS, and that stands for commercial off the shelf. What this term implies is a product that is designed for entertainment purposes. This is not something that the developers put out there specifically for educational use. But what I like to do and what I've found really works well for my students is repurposing outside media that these students are spending a lot of time on regardless, and finding ways to bring that into the classroom in order to boost instructional engagement and collaboration. So that's the general premise here. As I move forward with the presentation, there are a few links that you will need. So just let me know if you're unable to access them. I did just put them into the chat. These will primarily be used in the latter portion of the presentation, but just so you have them up front, I figured I'd go ahead and give them to you now. All right. So I use the term software here. Software is being selected instead of video games because a lot of this is available on a variety of platforms. What I will be using to demonstrate is a video game console. I'm loyal to the Microsoft Xbox. However, there are many out there. I also have a Nintendo Switch, PlayStation, and PC. There's all kinds of different ways of accessing this media. It honestly just comes down to preference most of the time. So that's why I use the blanket term software, because some of this can also be explored through PC and Mac. So what is my rationale for using video games, virtual simulations, whatever term you prefer? Well, I was born in the mid-'80s. I kind of straddle that generation between digital natives and digital immigrants. So I'd like to think I kind of have a unique perspective in the classroom because I remember a time when things were analog. However, I grew up in an era where we were making the tradition to digital. So I've really structured my career in trying to close that disconnect as much as possible. By trade, I am a social studies educator. Now I'm a professor of social studies education, but I did teach in the secondary classroom for 15 years. And Growing up, I was exposed to academic content through means outside of the traditional books and television and films. And most of my free time was consumed by playing video games and still is to a lesser degree these days. Prior to the 21st century, however, there was a real negative connotation surrounding the use of gaming, particularly in the classroom. I'm sure many of you recall the hearings that ultimately led to the video game rating system back in the mid 90s. There was a lot of hullabaloo around Mortal Kombat in particular. It's kind of wild that the US Congress was having these conversations. But they would often throw around terms involving sexism and violence and obsession and mindlessness and all of these tasks that are all of these descriptions, rather, that would not be apt for classroom adoption. However, as we're moving into contemporary world, the students are becoming so saturated by media. This is something that consumes them, that I think we're quite foolish to rely purely on the traditional forms of media, as I mentioned, books, television, and film. There has to be some buy-in, some meeting students halfway. And I truly believe that video games and a particular style of video game and method of harnessing video games is required to make this work. Now, as I mentioned, I am in the social studies, and the social studies has the unique position that we are not handcuffed by a standardized test. There are select states. I'm in New York State, and we offer, or we require, I should say, the Regents exam. I recently moved from Florida. They also have a similar version called the end of course exam. But generally speaking, there's no national social studies standardized test. The closest we have is a voluntary test known as the National Assessment of Educational Progress. And the most recent data that we have on this came out in 2018. They put it all together by subject area. They call it the nation's report card. And sadly, the numbers are pretty appalling. Only 15, 25, and 24% of eighth graders performed at or above proficiency level in the three primary social studies subjects: history, geography, and civics. So that's 15, 25, and 24 respectively. So clearly these numbers need to be improved. How we go about doing it, though, I think there's a lot of room for an open-ended discussion, and I'd like to throw my hat in the ring and offer a different tool for the educator's toolbox. So why video games? Well, like I mentioned, I love them, but it's not just me. The Pew Research Center, one of the most trusted names in national surveying in the United States, they polled a very diverse cross-section of US teenagers, and they found that somewhere around 90% report being regular consumers of video games. About half of the high school, middle school age students they surveyed answered affirmatively to playing a video game in the past 24 hours. So clearly this is a big part of their leisure time. And as I said, I believe we should meet them where we are. Now, many of these COTS games, as I said, they're marketed for entertainment purposes, but they actually turn out to be quite effective in teaching very complex skills, information that is attached to standards, regardless of the state or even the country. Many of this, much of this our presentation is geared towards the social studies. However, COTS video games can be repurposed for language arts conversations, literacy conversations, science conversations. Math is a little challenging, as it typically is when you try to infuse technology However, it's not a lost cause. There are ways of providing interdisciplinary frameworks in order to infuse math into the conversation as well. So my stance is, why not harness this pre-existing enthusiasm for this form of digital entertainment and try to connect it with the classroom content? As I mentioned, I'm a social studies educator, and the nationwide framework here in the United States is developed by the National Council for the Social Studies. So they've put out what they call the C3, civic competencies, things of that nature. So much of what I will be discussing is tied to those NCSS standards. Now, to provide a definition with video games, Barab, who's an Israeli researcher in the field, has defined video games as powerful tools that provide students or anyone playing with the ability to take part in these virtual quests. And they could expand classroom strategies, turn students into the roles of reporters, scientists, historians, and they're solving meaningful dilemmas and having conversations that are going to resonate with the students in ways that maybe a textbook wouldn't. Another one of the foundational researchers in digital game-based learning, or DGBL, if you're into the acronyms, is James Paul G. And back in 2005, he published what he called his Learning Principles of Good Gaming. I'm not going to go over all these bullet points, but the one that I wanted to highlight is that a game should be pleasantly frustrating. A game should challenge you to want to keep playing, but done in a way that is difficult. A game is not going to be a desirable experience if it's easily conquered. You have to struggle a little bit, much like life, right? We typically don't succeed on our first go. That's why we have extra lives in games, or continues. So the same premise is very true here. And also the ability to customize. What I'm going to be showing you today is a particular version of digital game-based learning that is teacher-led, in the sense that the educator is in the driver's seat. The students are taking an active role in the discussion, but the teacher is the primary person, or perhaps if you trust the student or two to take the lead. But early on, the teacher is the primary point person for the controller. So they really have to be fully aware of all the in-game choices. They need to know the map very well. They really have to become an expert in the game prior to the adoption for classroom use. So this might not be for everyone. I realize I am speaking to a potentially niche audience here, people who feel comfortable enough with using a game in a classroom, but also competent enough to provide really that expert level play that's needed to pull this off. So gaming has a long history in the classroom, as I'm sure you all are aware. In the social studies, much of it grows out of this movement in the early to mid 60s, known as the new social studies. And much of these early simulations, of course, were paper-based, right? The computers of the day were the size of, entire classrooms. So, in its infancy, much of this was done on paper with the teacher as the facilitator, and still is. There are some great paper-based simulations that are still available. I've used many in my years of classroom teaching. The problem is that much of the research that was put forth in this kind of 60s to 2000s era was not attached to a particular theory. And rarely did the games, kind of answer these broader contemporary notions of what social studies education should be. So as a result, we really forfeited much rich qualitative data that could have been harnessed through these studies that were completely absent because most of them that were put forth were tied to quantitative measures. There would be kind of the classic pre-test, play the simulation, post-test to look for learning gains rather. But all of that reflection, all of that discussion and collaboration went undocumented for the most part. So the whole process of getting to the post-test was lost, which to me is the most interesting part of this whole format, the conversations that take place leading up to that destination point. If you want to use that old classic analogy, it's not the destination, it's the journey. So that journey is the qualitative data, and much of that was lost. There are three principal genres of social studies themed video games. The first is what I'll be using today, and it's what's known as simulations. So simulations are semi-historical in their structure. They draw on concepts that are not specifically bound to times or places. However, the ones that I'll be using today went through very rigorous rubric testing in order to try to determine what are the best COTS games for classroom adoption in order to explore these social studies themes. The next genre is the counterfactual. The best version of this that you might be aware of is the Civilization franchise. So these games are set in historical settings, and they allow the player to take actions that could potentially change the course of history. So their decisions impact how the game plays out. I know for me, growing up playing games like Age of Empires, Civilization, Rise of Nations, it made me a more competent history, geography student just by way of playing the games. I think there is definitely a conversation to be had about students doing this in their free time and then using that content knowledge that they acquire in the classroom. The last version is what's known as a documentary adventure or role-playing game. So there's a great version of this put out by WNYC called Mission US. We played it in my classroom a few weeks ago. These games are true to real life historical events. And what's unique about these is that you're taking on the role of an actual historical figure. So they're all tied to primary sources, and the interactions that you have are constructed around the real life historical actors that the games are based upon. All right. In terms of my research, and this is ongoing, but the conclusions that I'm going to share with you here today are based on participants when I was teaching at a Florida public charter high school. It was in the Tampa area, in case you cared. And all of the participants in this study were members of the Video Game Club, which was a weekly social organization that they voluntarily took part in. It was quite a diverse club, primarily male, but there were female members as well. It was coeducational, like I just mentioned, and there were about 30 diehard members. Some would, kind of come and go, but there was this core group of 30. And I believe I mentioned weekly before. That was an error. It was a bi-weekly club. We held meetings every other week. So that's where I extracted the participants from. It was a convenient sample, in case you care. The students, as I mentioned, high school age, so 14 through 18. And what we would do in the typical video game club session, this is not affiliated with the research study, is that we would play some culturally significant video game. I tried to pull things from my personal collection. I have over 1,000 video games dating back from the late 70s. I have the original Magnavox Odyssey, whatever. We can talk about gaming history all day. But the games that I pulled out were all tied to some higher order thinking questions. And I tried to hold a discussion around the game rather than just passive gameplay. So from this collection of pupils, I attained 14 research participants. So from the 30 dedicated members, I had 14 sign on. This was all done ethically through institutional review board documentation, and we had parent consent, and all of the boxes were checked. So they were enthusiastic about the responsibilities required by the study. All right, how did I choose the game? I believe I mentioned I used a particular rubric. This rubric was developed by the researcher. I believe he's out of the University of Texas, El Paso, a gentleman by the name of Rice, and he put together two rubrics. The first is called the Video Game Higher Order Thinking Evaluation rubric. So you can kind of make it out there. You can see it's kind of a yes or no. Does the game include this? If so, check the box. And then you add up all the points, and based on the score of the games, you can determine if it is viable for cognitive use in the classroom. So all of the games that I will be selecting for this study, and the ones that have my seal of approval, have all received very high scores on Rice's scales. How did I stage discussion? I put together these 90-minute interdisciplinary lessons. They cut across cultures, they cut across themes. There was economic discussion, technological discussion, societal, things involving the environment. All of these topics were tied to that NAEP test that I mentioned in the beginning of this presentation. And so the idea was to have discussions based on these content standards, but driven through the video game. That was sort of the backdrop that sparked these conversations. All of the sessions were recorded. As I said, the students signed consent waivers. And so I had a GoPro Hero 5 set up in the classroom. I had digital voice recorders. So it was all documented. Thousands of pages of transcription by the end of this. It was a brutal task to sift through this and make sense of it. But I'm thankful to have all of this textual and audio and visual information because I can continue to write articles about it for years to come. And of course, I plan on conducting similar studies as well. This is what's known as a phenomenological case study, because we are basing the activity around the phenomenon of game-based learning. So the first, middle, and last week of the study contained brief small group interviews. I had asked the students to come in usually before school and have a conversation, kind of the state of affairs involving the study, sort of their connection to games. If you're curious, what some of the questions were, I threw a couple up here. So how do you socialize while gaming? Why are video games important to you? How do video games specifically help you learn social studies concepts? So I kept revisiting these questions at 3 points over the course of the 9-week study, and their answers changed quite a bit. We did see kind of the evolution of how they saw video games used to explore these academic themes. They collaborated in small groups as well as individually over the course of these sessions, and they would respond to these higher order thinking tasks that were all based on this virtual setting. As I mentioned, each week had a corresponding game, and I'll go over what those games were in a moment. But they all were tied to a particular theme. So you could see this still that I have. This is from Fallout 4. And what we were looking at there was environmental degradation. We were looking at nuclear proliferation. We were looking at scarcity of resources. If you're not familiar with the Fallout franchise, as the name implies, it takes place in this post-apocalyptic setting kind of after the United States and the rest of the world duke it out with nuclear weapons. And, this is the world we left behind. So, some of this is based in an alternate reality, but the vast majority of the games that I selected were painstakingly recreated by developers using primary sources in order to recreate some elements of history that might have been lost to time. A good example of this, I used Assassin's Creed Odyssey. So if you're not familiar with that one, it's set in classical Greece, sort of towards the end of the high period of Athens, leading up to time of the Persians and that sort of thing. So a lot of what was present from that period in history is no longer around. It's no longer standing. You can't visit a lot of these landmarks. So a game like Assassin's Creed Odyssey really opens up a student or anyone playing this game's mind to what these environments looked like centuries or millennia ago. And that's not possible to go to these sites and or to use Google Earth in order to visit these places around the world, because they simply don't exist. So in many ways, these secondary sources of video games are often the best ways that we can interact with these lost places from the past. Another thing that I want to mention, and I'm sure I'll hit on this later on, is that throughout the course of these lessons, that the students had the ability to participate traditionally, raising their hand, sharing their thoughts, kind of the standard oral discussion, but also digitally. So I used tools like Nearpod, Poll Everywhere, in order to collect their thoughts, because not every student is socially inclined to participate. There is that element of uncertainty and lack of confidence, but by way of digital conversations, an educator can pull in the shyest of students into the discussion. So that's a big part of my research and what I espouse in the classroom. All of this dialogue was supported by primary and secondary source analysis. Prior to the lesson occurring each week, the students were given documents for review. This is known as the flipped classroom model. And so they had a preview of what would be discussed over the course of the lesson. And of course, this works best when the students do take the time to review the content, which admittedly is not always practical. They juggle a lot of responsibilities, but they were dedicated to this. So for the most part, the students were aware of what we were discussing prior to the lesson beginning each week. So as I mentioned, it was a teacher-led tour. So I was in charge of the controller, and I led the avatar, who's, if you don't know the term, that's the game figure, I guess we'll call it the protagonist of the game, the person you would be controlling in that virtual environment. And I would take them on this interactive tour, which would then be tied to those primary and secondary sources. Going through the weeks now, I'm sure some of you were interested. What did this guy use? What kind of games can be appropriate for the classroom? Well, the Assassin's Creed series is superb, as I mentioned, because they really do take the time to go through the primary sources that are available in order to structure these past historical settings as accurately as possible. So the first week I used Origins, which is set in ancient Egypt. I believe around the time of the Roman conquest of Egypt. So not exactly ancient, but, past the old and the middle and the new kingdoms, kind of on the downfall of Egypt, right? Cleopatra era. And so we looked into themes involving architecture, symbolism, and religion. What is interesting about the setting in this one is, although we are in the New Kingdom, many of the elements of the Middle and the Old Kingdoms still persist and are very much in the mindset of the quote unquote average Egyptian. So we had some really rich conversations around things like symbolism. When you enter a temple, what's the impression that the worshiper would be experiencing in that moment? And as I mentioned, a lot of this is lost to history. So accessing it through the game is really the only way that you could recreate these conversations around these historical actors. The second week, I already mentioned this one. This was Odyssey, which is set in ancient Greece. Themes discussing mythology, diplomacy, rivalries, the various city-states involved. Week 3 was Assassin's Creed 3. This is set during the American War for Independence. And what I tied the lesson to in this one was primarily the concept of creating a new world order, kind of something out of nothing. And then as this is going on, what is the perspective of those left out of the conversation? So I had primary sources written from female points of view, African-American points of view, Native American points of view, African-American female points of view, in order to kind of get the ball rolling around what it would be like to be part of such this critical period of history, but left out of the dialogue for the most part. Week 4, another Assassin's Creed game. This one was Syndicate. This one is set during the Second Industrial Revolution. So much of the conversation was shaped around economics, caste systems, wealth inequality, pollution. You could see it's actually set in London, but much of the environment would be very similar to any late 19th century American metropolis as well. Week 5 was Red Dead Redemption 2, which is actually the game I'm going to use in my little sample for you in the second half of this presentation. This one is set in the late 19th century American West, and the themes discuss the human-environment interaction, the technological conquest of nature, kind of the beginnings of what we consider to be the modern era. And then week 6, sticking with that modernity theme, I used Battlefield 1. This one, as the name implies, is set in World War I. So the themes involved were the futility of war, designing these weapons in order to maximize body count, and really the birth of these modern ideas of nationalism and warfare and, kind of things that we're still struggling with in many ways. Take the Middle East, for example. Much of that current map was shaped by the diplomacy occurring after World War I. So a lot of this is still relevant today. And Battlefield 5 was week 7. This one is set in World War II. So a lot of what we looked at there was involving propaganda, this us versus them mentality. And then the final week, Grand Theft Auto 5. I know what you're thinking. GTA, is this guy out of his mind? Well, if used properly, GTA can actually be a wonderful teaching tool. This one is set in contemporary California. So we had discussions dealing with ecological diversity, humans coinciding with nature, humans developing nature, making nature work for them. So really fascinating stuff. And then I know I said 9 weeks. The first week was a pilot study using that Fallout 4 game that I mentioned previously. So since you're probably wondering what this looked like, since I've been building it up for the better part of an hour, I'm going to switch screens here and I'm going to share with you. Doesn't seem to be allowing me to select it. Let me try it this way. Thank you for your patience, everybody. Video. Share. All right. And I had a specific point I wanted to start from. 30 seconds in. That's easy to remember. All right. 30 seconds. Okay, I think we're all loaded up. Thank you again for bearing with me, everybody. So this one is an example of a typical conversation. This particular week was week 2, so I'm using the Assassin's Creed Odyssey. And I believe we're going to see communication around Spartan imagery. So if you've watched 300 or anything Sparta themed, I'm sure you'll be able to follow here.
Column, sure.
You can see like these gladiators.
Yes.
That's what I believe they were called, or
Right.
Spartans.
Yeah.
And like instead of what you saw in Athens, which is more of a knowledgeable, more political view, if I could say.
Okay.
And here it gives you more of a power is everything. Power is the way you survive.
Yeah. Might makes right.
Yes.
As the expression goes. Very good. Yeah.
I was
The
gonna ask
emphasis
that.
on the words. Let's get Patrick in, and we'll go to you.
All right.
Yeah.
Question.
Yes.
The gladiators, Spartans on the columns, right?
Yes.
I wonder if they have different faces, like different kinds of peoples all fighting, or
That's a
are
good
they all the
question.
same?
Are they all the same, or are they unique characters?
Wait, maybe they show that. Maybe so you. I mean, can you? I don't think you can find the column.
I don't think I can, but if I had the use of the Falcon and the, the original story mode,
Oh, I see.
we could probably get a closer view of their faces. That'll have to wait for another time.
Are they
I see.
in like different stances?
Seems as though they're all in the same stance,
I mean,
With the same weapon.
with
I
the
mean,
same weapon.
yeah, I mean,
They call these soldiers hoplites, and so they would get in a certain formation where they were protected at all sides, the phalanx formation. You probably saw in 300. And so, this was a way in which they could ensure that they were defended, but they could also attack with their spears at the same time. So it was a very particular way of fighting. Sorry, Ella.
that's all right.
Yeah.
So, real quick thing.
Yes.
I'm gonna add to Gianni's point.
Yeah.
I thought it was very interesting.
Mhm.
Like, so if they're all the same, like, how do you think they did? Like, did it look exactly the same? Because I know they did that a lot throughout statues in history. Because
Mhm.
copy and paste wasn't exactly a thing. Back then,
Right,
So,
right.
yeah.
They had a mold, they had a cast, and they would just, cast it multiple times
I
in the
see.
same mold.
Yeah.
So there was copy and paste.
It was basically an ancient copy and paste.
Also,
Yeah.
from what I see, because Sparta was a military. It was so military.
Yes.
They saw fighting as their life, as their blessing,
Mhm.
for example.
Okay. So a little sample of a typical conversation we would have in one of the early weeks of this study. But, I think you got a good sense of the student interest level, very high, and some pretty high level conversations as well. I was very pleased with the maturity of their discussions, and it only got better as the lessons progressed. When we got to the final week, using Grand Theft Auto, for example, we were discussing some things that I don't think they would have been capable early on. So, they definitely evolved as learners, and I definitely improved as an educator using this particular method. By the way, I don't believe that I mentioned all of the games that I selected are a particular style of video game. It's what's known as an open world title. So it allows you, controlling the avatar, to explore the environment as you please. You're not tied to particular objectives within the game. You can free roam. Sometimes they're referred to as sandbox style games. So all of the discussions were based around these higher order questions. I believe I mentioned I used Nearpod, I used Poll Everywhere, and we had these textual trends emerged. I then employed the qualitative software known as Deduce, and I was able to determine themes that were present in these student comments. And as they were engaging in the socialization process as well, much of this emerged organically, although I did lead them with these probing questions if they wanted to talk more or less about a particular topic. I would just let the conversation run. I think I mentioned I did conduct a pilot study prior to the data collection, so I was able to streamline this process a little more, determine the proper sample size, data collection techniques, how to best capture student responses, things of that nature. All of the students were provided with an electronic device. They all had Chromebooks, and so they were all Wi-Fi equipped, thereby enabling maximum input in the digital discussion that emerged. And lastly, this was all voluntary. None of these methods were used in my classroom teaching. It was all after class, all extracurricular activities. So, it's not as though the students were required to take part in this. This was all their decision. So what conclusions did I reach over the course of these 9 weeks and then many more months of data analysis? Well, I determined that COTS video games offer an alternative entry point. And I know I use this term a lot in teaching. I really believe that as educators, now more so than ever, we need to be flexible in how we approach our curriculum and set students up for success. So using a video game in order to talk about Greek city-states might be the secret sauce that unlocks it for a particular type of student. And as you heard, it allows for these really higher order level discussions to emerge when the teacher is in the driver's seat. The teacher is the one framing the discussion. However, as the inquiry is unfolding, the students take the baton and pass it to one another. And you could see that motivation and engagement build. So they have this combination of face-to-face plus digital discourse. This improves their interpersonal skills. There's obviously a great deal of media literacy taking place here. And then all the civic competencies and standards-based competencies that go along with the themes that were discussed by way of these digital games. A lot of the students early on, I mentioned, did need some help in terms of the discussion element, the dialogue. So I did provide them with templates that kind of got tossed out as the study progressed, but definitely consider scaffolding because you want to ensure that this is an engaging, disciplined, academic conversations. You don't want them just saying, well, I love this game because, it's violent and I like to, do things that I could never do in reality. I hope not, right? But no, that's not the purpose of this. The game is a secondary source in the same way that a piece of music or a film clip is. It's a teaching tool. And so, of course, it has to be structured academically and responsibly. So students might need a little help in getting their conversations up to snuff early on. And always tie the lessons in that hierarchical manner. So, I would begin in the lower levels of Bloom's famous pyramid. And then as the lesson progresses or as the weeks progress, if you do decide to create a unit, or maybe multiple units using this method, work your way up that taxonomic pyramid. There were obviously limitations to this. I will be the first to admit that this method does have its flaws. So I was at the time, the current or former teacher of many of the participants. So I did hold somewhat of a position of authority over them, whether it was informal authority or not, that's to be determined. So this dynamic could have served as a potential barrier. Maybe they wouldn't be as comfortable with me as, me doing this at an institution where I had no connection to the students. So it might have diminished their level of candidness and the degree to which they participated verbally or textually. Additionally, whenever you're dealing with technology, it comes as no surprise that there's a great degree, and I put a certain degree, but I would say a great degree of unpredictability. over the course of 9 weeks, we dealt with poor internet connectivity, limited battery life on some of the computers. They weren't properly charged. Whenever you're employing web-based or internet-based lessons, there's always room for distraction. Some of the students are going to go off in their own world. So, you have to use proxemics and, different ways to rein in their focus. And sometimes the data collection tools weren't flawless. So this is just a small sampling of the issues that I incurred and will continue to have to deal with to a certain degree as I continue to use this. Lastly, was participant mortality. There were 3 respondents that withdrew prior to the study's conclusion. So the way that I attempted to eliminate this mortality is that for every week they attended, they received a $5 gift card to GameStop, which I thought was appropriate considering they're part of the video game club, right? They, like to spend money in their free time playing games. So over the course of the 8 weeks, if they attended all 8 sessions, they would walk away with $40 in gift cards. So there was some incentivization in order to ensure that they were attending each week. The implications after this study, I found that for pupils who struggle in a traditional lecture format with the instructor kind of guiding the conversation, are now able to participate through these back channels, like Nearpod, like Poll Everywhere, where they can take part, but they don't necessarily have to take an active part by raising their hand and speaking. Their comment could be just as powerful in guiding the conversation, given the educator highlights their response too. It's a two-way street. So they do have the opportunity to take part. And as educators, I think using this approach, we're gaining access to a host of new pedagogical methods and different materials. So if we harness these tools, like digital game-based learning, we can create a more critically reflective, media-savvy group of learning cohorts. And finally, to impart a more functional and more efficient toolbox to educators going through divisions of education on the collegiate level, or maybe they're going back to school for graduate degrees. Perhaps colleges and universities might want to adopt this methodology in order to give the educators another way of connecting with their students. It's my experience that much of what occurs in colleges of ed might not have practical applications, but I believe that this particular style of interacting with the content would, under certain circumstances. As I mentioned, it's not for everybody, and I accept that. So in terms of my future research, what I'd like to do, and I'm big on the qualitative end of it, although I do think there is some value in that standard pretest simulation post-test model. Most of what I'm interested are the conversations that are shaped during this game-based dialogue. But what I would suggest when I do this again, I mentioned I had 14. Now, a class of 14, higher ed, sure, that's realistic. But I know, for many years, I had sometimes 30 plus in my classroom. So I would want to try this again with a larger sample size, with a more diverse group in terms of their connection to games. All of these students were pulled from the video game club. So there was that inherent bias. They like games. Why wouldn't they like games to be used in the classroom in order to approach this content? In Florida, the core subjects like social studies, it's capped at 25. There are ways of getting around that, but that's a whole different discussion. So my next shot at this, I would like to have group of participants in that kind of 25 to 30 range. Additionally, I believe that in terms of the flipped classroom, front loading with the primary sources, it sometimes became a little wordy. I heard some feedback from the students. So decreasing the textual burden involved and kind of priming them for each lesson, I think would be a good idea in order to create a more balanced, more focused conversation. So that's something that I would want to adapt a bit in order to safeguard the success of this in the future. And lastly, for me or for anyone attempting this method, I would say that the dream team would be to have the educator working in conjunction with a gameplay consultant, because I realize that not every educator is like me, who basically was born with a controller in hand, and they might not feel as comfortable using this method. However, if you have that gameplay expert on the team, they can work with an individual or with a small group of educators and try to, match the strengths of both parties in order to attune the lesson to whatever the pedagogical objectives are. So this in turn would allow the data collection to run more smoothly, and you could impart even more COTS open world titles, not just the 9 that I suggested. There are so many out there, but they have to be repurposed for this academic conversation. I think I'm around my time, Lauren, right? I think I'm a little over actually, but I'll stop it there because I imagine we probably have some questions. And then, as you know, I've got the second session coming up where I am actually going to go through one of these lessons with you. You'll be able to see the game in action and sort of the probing questions that would emerge organically in this lesson. So I'll stop it there, and I'll turn it over to Lauren or whoever has any questions, comments, or concerns for me.
Okay, I just want to say make sure that you sign the sign-in sheet that I sent in the chat. And I want to thank you, Dr. Patterson, for your presentation. I know in the class we talked about Mission USA and everything, and I never realized, like, when you talked about Grand Theft Auto, that you could use that in the classroom. So it was really eye-opening to see how the games can be used in the classroom.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Anyone else? Any burning comments here? Things that I can clarify
I have
for?
a question.
Sure.
So when did you come up with this idea to introduce gaming into your lessons and into your curriculum? Like, were you just playing a game one day and thought about it, or how did you come up with that idea? It's a great idea also. The presentation was great.
Thank you so much, Shelby. For me, it started pretty early on in life. I can recall, I guess I was elementary school age, and I played this game on the Super Nintendo. I know I'm dating myself, called Liberty or Death. And this is a turn-based strategy simulation game that's set during the American Revolution. And what I realized in playing this game is I was able to kind of cite all these particular details about the revolution without reading any kind of textbook, any sort of traditional content. It stuck with me. And, I would have these conversations with my parents or friends or really anybody who would listen about how, these aren't just passive recreational tools. These can really shape some meaningful learning for particular individuals. And like I mentioned in my presentation, it's not going to work across the board, but neither is any activity. So when I started in the classroom, I realized that, I kind of have to find my way first. I'm not going to make anyone uncomfortable by putting out these ideas. But once I got into my graduate level classes, I was able to speak with people who shared my enthusiasm, and they encouraged me to develop these lessons. not just talk about how I could develop these lessons. So I would say this was roughly about 5 years ago when I actively began creating lessons from beginning to end that were all infused around a particular COTS title, commercial off-the-shelf video game. Hope that
Thank you
answers
so
your
much.
question.
Yes, it did. Thank you.
No problem. I think we have a few things in the chat. Oh, just some thanks. I'm happy to do it. I'm happy to talk about any of these. If you want, I could put my contact information. If you didn't see it in the presentation, you're welcome to email me and I will share any of this with you, or I can elaborate on any of these themes. But do stick around for the second part because that's really going to get fun then. Lauren, do you want me to wait on that 5 minutes, or do you think it's best if I just jump into it now?
I would say probably wait because, yeah, they're closing the breakout rooms.
Okay.
And then they're going to reassign the breakout rooms. So
Cool. All right. Well, I'm going to take a quick break, but I will be back at 2 o'clock. See you then.
Just gonna wait a minute or two to let more people to come in, and then we can get started.
Christy, would you like me to get going now?
I'll do you want me to reintroduce you?
Yeah, why not?
Perfect. Okay, so good afternoon, guys. My name is Christy Blymeyer, and I'm the fundraising chair of Sigma Tau chapter of KDP. And I would now like to welcome you to the second session. Oh no, breakout rooms are closing. Okay. I'll just keep going for 18 seconds. I'd like to welcome you to the second part of Dr. Patterson's session. He is an assistant professor of education here at the Mount, and I'll give you the reminders before the session once the breakout rooms close. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Oh, yes, so Dr. Patterson is an assistant professor of education here at the Mount. Just a few reminders before we begin. Hopefully everyone who wants to be in here is in here. We would love for you to mute your microphone until the Q&A part of the program. And once that begins, please take a minute to sign in on the document that I will be sending out later in the session. And then with that being said, let's start Dr. Patterson's session.
Well, thank you again, Christy. Even better the second time. I welcome everybody back seems like we have a lot of the same faces, but some new ones as well. So thank you for joining me for the thrilling conclusion of my presentation. This is going to take a different approach than the last one. Last one was much more static. This is very much an interactive version. Now, given that you all have maybe limited knowledge on the topic because you didn't have the information prior, like my students would in this situation, I don't expect the most involvement, but feel free, create that dialogue between us, because that's what this is all about. I did want to mention prior to getting into this, in that, the focus of this conference is pandemic pedagogy, but this can be applied post-pandemic. However, I do think it works very well in this climate, given that, as you're going to see, all that's really required is a single console or PC or Mac, and then the various data collection tools that the educator would facilitate. So it's quite cost effective. You don't need to buy 25 Xboxes for class. It just requires the one, and of course the corresponding games, which can go between $50 and $60. So, it can get pricey, but a gamer like me, I've got the games anyway, might as well use them. All right, let's jump into it. I'm going to put those links up again for you all. It looks like they disappeared. Great. One moment here, I'll get them back up just so everybody can take part. So the first one, if you would like to take part, that is Nearpod. Second is going to be the Poll Everywhere link. And you might need an https:// like I have there for the Nearpod. I don't think you will, but in order to create the hyperlink, apparently you do need it. So you're going to have to copy and paste it. Okay, so those are the.
Sorry to interrupt you. Is
Yeah,
there
no
a 5-letter code that we should
Yes,
enter
I'm going to
pod?
show you that momentarily.
Perfect. Sorry.
Of course. Yep. I just wanted to give it to everybody beforehand. All right. So those are the 3 links that I'm going to be using. The Nearpod, as I mentioned, or as Christy mentioned, does require a code, which is, where are you, code? There you are. All right. So the code, I'll throw that into the chat as well. There we go. So if you'd like to play along at home, your code is URF6K. If you're unfamiliar with Nearpod, it functions similarly to a PowerPoint or slideshow presentation, except that it is dynamic. It's interactive. You can pause for student input. You can draw things as the educator, kind of has that whiteboard built-in capability. So it's a very, very useful tool. I know there are a lot of competitors out there, but I will sing Nearpod's praises, and no, they are not paying me, in case you were wondering. I also have activated what's called student paced mode. So if you would like to stay on the screen share and do what I do, follow along with me, wonderful. If you're more of the ADHD type, like I tend to be at times, you can explore on your own time, spend more or less time on a particular document, because a lot of this, as I mentioned in my preliminary presentation, does involve some primary and secondary source analysis. So totally your call, whatever works best for you. But let's get going here. So this game is Red Dead Redemption 2. It is set in the American West. The locations are not tied to any particular place. However, there are elements of Colorado, New Orleans, kind of the Plain States. So it's got a good chunk of the country represented. And the year is 1898. So we're just about on just about into the turn of the century, and a lot is changing socially, technologically. And so kind of the narrative that runs through this game is the characters adapting to these changes, some more successfully than others. All of this is tied to social studies standards. When I created these lessons, I was in the state of Florida. So there we used what's known as the Next Generation Sunshine State Standards. New York uses the Next Generation New York State Standards. So, all of this, I think, is pretty interchangeable based on where you are in the country. You'll just have to find the specific codes that go along with it. So the standards that we're looking at in this one, determining how the development of steel, oil, transportation, communication, and business practices affected the U.S. economy, in addition to analyzing the changes that occurred as the U.S. shifted from an agrarian to an industrial society. So that's kind of what's at the root of this particular lesson, but it does go much deeper. Now, I did provide you with that Poll Everywhere tab, or link rather, and if you pull that up, you should see something that looks like this. Let me move my Zoom bar a little bit. Now, if you've never used Poll Everywhere, as the name implies, it is just a survey tool that you can pose various questions with. And I liked using it as a warm-up activity for students. So what I would do is I would randomize a series of primary sources, placing them on the student's desk prior to their arrival for the lesson. And they were then in charge with using the historical inquiry tools that we had been developing over the course of these sessions in order to determine what their source was all about. What was the meaning, the message, who created the source, right? The author, where their eyes go, what the purpose was. And you can see the sources emerging here. This is all based on student input. It's kind of, circling through here. But in case you're wondering what they were looking at, I'm going to stop the share here just briefly and pull up this. So hopefully everybody's able to see these images. This is one of the Carlisle Indian School. So that's something that a student might receive, or perhaps they'd receive this photograph. I'm just kind of scrolling through here so you get a sense of what they would begin the lesson with. Some are more heavily text-based, some are primarily imagery. Like I said, it's just randomized on the participants' desks. They come in, they have one or two of these in order to try to make sense of. So that's what's beginning the lesson here, to get them in the mindset of what we're going to be discussing over the course of this 90-minute session. Going back to the Poll Everywhere, there were a few more questions, and I'll show you the student responses. So what'd you notice that you didn't expect based on their primary source? Powerful words and ideas that were expressed, questions that the primary source raises. And you can, see the student responses. All the land that was once the Native Americans is now being sold off for basically nothing, which is super disrespectful by today's standards. But back then, they were just roadblocks. And so a lot of this is incredibly detailed, rich. Like I said, when I went back and sifted through the student comments, I had so much, and still do have so much to work with. It's really fascinating, their input over the course of this 9-week journey, more so than any learning gains. I'm primarily focused on their contributions during these discussions. And lastly, you can see a word cloud. That's one of the options that Poll Everywhere provides. They have all kinds of different question formats. And so based on the question, what feeling and thoughts does the primary source trigger in you? Be as specific as possible with your descriptive words. So technology, standing out, Mormons, wonder. I'm just kind of picking what jumps out at me, tribes, unexpectedness. And so these word clouds, I think, can be quite the sentence or quite the discussion starter. I've used word clouds, for example, when dealing with primary source historical documents. I'll put them into a word cloud formatter, and sometimes it makes it much more digestible for a student rather than seeing a block of text. They're able to interact and synthesize the information much more efficiently using the word clouds. For certain students, a lot of this, like I said, it's going to be need to be differentiated based on your group. Everybody has a particular type of student with different levels of engagement. So you have to find what works best for you. I'm just providing you with a tool in the toolbox, as I mentioned in my previous presentation. So that's the warm up. And, this would go on for, 5 to 10 minutes, maybe after students share their responses. Then we go into kind of more of the foundational background knowledge elements of the lesson. And so they had to do some reading. This is based on the Annenberg Center provided these pretty complete chapter analyses of various stages of American history. This is just what I selected for this particular lesson. But as you could see, there is quite a bit, looks like they've got 26 different eras of history represented. So they get kind of a sense of what's going to be covered, sort of an overview of the themes that run through this part of American history. The first primary source that we looked at, and they were given this up front, like I mentioned, it was flipped classroom model. So all of this was preloaded, front loaded for them before they entered the classroom that day. We looked at the very first telegram that was ever communicated by Samuel Morse. And I know it's difficult to make out on your end, but to spoil it for you, he says in there, among other things, he says, "What hath God wrought?" And, if you don't speak Old English biblical talk very often these days, it basically translates to, "What have I done?" Kind of similar feelings to probably what Oppenheimer felt after developing the first atomic bomb. So feelings of extreme regret based on this new medium and this new way of interacting with one another. So I thought this was kind of a great way to stage the early parts of this lesson. And they had some fun with this Morse code translator, which you can play around with if you'd like. Whatever your message is, you can input it and then it plays the Morse code and telegram communication. The country is changing rapidly. And it's changing before the eyes of individuals who were born into a very different America. So what I have here is some early footage, and we're not going to watch the whole thing, of what skyscraper construction would look like back around the turn of the century, 1906. We're starting to build up. For many years, cities, urban centers were limited by the square mileage, but now you can build up into the air. We've, kind of determined how to use steel most efficiently in order to provide that rigorous foundation required to hold up a very tall structure. So they have this primary source footage that they could look at, the construction of the changing cities. We have very early versions, this is from Edison films, of automobiles being, for the very first time in American streets, being seen by individuals, and sort of the changing of the guard in terms of the horse and buggy or the carriage onto this mechanized vehicle. So this is sort of the backdrop that I would then fire up the game with. And if you visit that Twitch stream that I provided you with in the chat, it's that twitch.tv/chatwithjpat, you will be able to see the world that is present in Red Dead Redemption 2. Now, this city is representative of New Orleans. Quite the urban metropolis era, all kinds of new technologies being rolled out here. The volume on my weird funky feedback. You kind of want to show students the changing architecture that's made available. And the one thing I wanted to highlight is the emergence of these motion picture shows. So we just saw some early examples of this. For many individials, this was their very first experience in seeing motion pictures. So you're going now into a very early version of movie theaters, and not quite at the picture palaces. And they're able to see what the experience would be like for an individual in this era. So I'm going to take a seat here. Enjoy the chat. A lot of this early filmmaking was animation. But, they kind of have a sense of how this is quite different from the animation that they're experiencing. And all of the content in this game is based on actual footage that would have been available at this era. So another one that is present when I previously walked into this theater, they were discussing the dangers, rather, of alternating current versus direct current, and that whole fear campaign that Edison and his people put out. We're going up to the balcony now, and so we can discuss how, based on your skin color, where you would be able to enjoy these shows. So having these rich conversations that might not be able to be formatted by way of more traditional tools. This is all interactive. I'm the one at the helm here. I'm controlling everything. The character decisions are controlled by me. I'm going to pause that momentarily. We will get back to the game. I apologize if the stream is a little choppy in terms of the quality. I promise it looks a lot better in person, but this is designed for that remote classroom where you would have digital learners taking part in the discussion. Getting back to the Nearpod now, I got a couple questions that I posed to the students and I'll now pose to you. Would you say that this concept of inventive genius is an important component of what it means to be an American? Do we have this inherent desire to be entrepreneurs and what forces in society encourage invention. Now, if you're interested in taking part, by all means, you can respond on your end, but it's not required. This is simply to show you what the discussion would be tailored around based on this particular lesson. If you want to turn the mic on and answer orally, you're more than welcome to. I tried to design the second part of this lesson to be as interactive as possible, but it's totally your choice, whatever direction you want to take this. And I did put on that student paste. So if you want to go back and answer some of these on your own time, it's totally your prerogative. All right, let's keep it moving here since I'm not seeing any immediate answers. That takes us to our first primary source. So the students were required to read the Luddite Manifesto, published in 1812. And if you're not familiar with it, you can access it by way of this PDF viewer. It will pull up the PDF here. You can see it's not too overwhelming in terms of its textual analysis. It's just kind of that one extended paragraph. So, if you want to take a moment to look that over, again, this wasn't meant to actually be a lesson for you. This is a sample lesson of what you might construct if you're interested in using this game-based approach. So my follow-up question based on the document: who were the Luddites and what did they want? Can you draw on any modern parallels to their movement? Not everyone in society was in favor of this rapidly changing landscape. There were many, particularly in the earlier parts of the 19th century, who didn't necessarily want to adopt this kind of groundbreaking technological change. And so it did some resistance. And, I think early on in the 19th century, we see more holdouts than others. But, by the time we've entered the latter stages of the 19th century, more and more people are on board. So it is something that I think we can look at today and say maybe those who deny social media, those who maybe don't use smartphones. I wouldn't go as extreme as to say Amish or lifestyles or Orthodox Judaism, movements like that aren't nearly as common as individuals who don't use Facebook, right? But depending on how extreme an example you want to delve into, a lot of discussion can take place around this technological rejection. The next thing that we looked at is a secondary source primary source dealing with the idea of railroads. And so railroads, by the time this was published, 1911, had already crisscrossed the country, really defined communication, transportation, the ability to move humans and goods. So I would have the students listen to the lyrics of the Railroad Rag, which I will play for you here, a little sampling of.
Did you ever hear about the railroad rag? Toot, 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 it's a joyful jag. See the train a-going round the curve. I feel that engine swerve. Engineers are humming a peculiar strain. In your heart you get a pain. All the people on the train have caught the drag. Now everybody's humming that railroad rag. Oh, oh, that railroad rag. Oh, oh, that railroad rag. It's so...
All right, this is a little piece of that one. And then I would follow it up with this secondary source from the perspective of Native Americans, how they would react to the railroad sprouting up on their ancestral homes. And so we have here some quotations from some various Native American leaders: spotted tail, Roman nose, bear-toothed, 10 bears. You can see, kind of the conversation around the idea of progress from their perspective. And then, of course, from the American or anglicized perspective, Commissioner of Indian Affairs, George Custer, individuals like that. So the follow-up question
all this talk about the wonders of the 1900s
involving the railroad would be, how do Native Americans see the railroad? How does their relationship with nature differ from American settlers? And what was the role of U.S. government in all of this? So some pretty powerful concepts being explored in this one that I think in many ways, we're still struggling with when we're redefining what will the future of the United States look like.
won't be so dang cheap.
The next item I have here is Manifest Destiny, which I think ties nicely in with this idea of the emergence of railroads. So if you're on the Switch stream, you can see now that my character is at the train station. Well, I'm actually at the post office where I can buy train station tickets. And I'm going to select one of the destinations here, and then we'll go to a cutscene where the character is taking a railroad trip. So you can see, kind of from the perspective of an individual around the turn of the century, how centralized the rail lines were in order to connect this country. And so, if you want to spend more time on the train, you're able to, since you're in control of the avatar. Or if you want to exit the train, get off at the station, that's entirely your choice. It's all determined by what your purpose is for this particular lesson. And you notice there is a load time. That's, I guess, one of the downsides to this method, because these maps are so rich, and you can see the level of detail put into these games. It does require some time in order to set the scene. So we're pulling up in one of these mining towns now. It's not an actual location, but it's based on some real locations that popped up around the country during this period. And, just kind of looking around, you could see a very different version of America compared to what Native Americans, called home for millennia. We can see the beginnings of environmental degradation, really shifting the landscape to suit human needs. If we look into this water, you can see that reflection of oil present. So, these games are tremendously complex in how you can relate the content back to the academic standards and have some really wonderful discussions. So I'll pause it here momentarily. We will return to Red Dead Redemption in a moment. But in terms of Manifest Destiny, this is an idea, a concept that's thrown around quite a bit in US history classes today. But it actually has quite an interesting story to it. And if you have the time or the inclination to watch the History Channel video that I provided you with, you'll hear a conversation put forth by an academic by the name of Matthew Pinkser around the idea of Manifest Destiny. I'm not going to play it for you just in the interest of time, but that's the beauty of Nearpod, in that you can go back and control these slides at your own pace. But after they get a little background knowledge on Manifest Destiny as a concept, they would then pair that with the author of the individual who coined the term manifest destiny, John L. Sullivan. So it first popped up in the newspapers in 1845, and you can read, his version of manifest destiny from his perspective. And then that would be followed by a question so what does O'Sullivan's article reveal about American attitudes toward other nations and themselves? And so I think that you're going to find the students are quite capable of having these higher level conversations when given the time to explore at home or leading up to the class. They need that prep time. They need that think time. They need the ability to maybe annotate. And these are all things that you'll have to guide them to do as the educator. It's not, okay, let's jump in and do it. There is hours and hours of prep work involved in a lesson like this. So as I mentioned in my last session, it might not be for everybody. And that's okay. If I can reach a small percentage of educators who feel like this would resonate with their students, and based on what I've seen from the chat, it sounds like there may be some adopters. I'm doing my job as a researcher, as an academic, and as a practicing educator. So let's continue on here, just in the interest of time. Here we have two landmark pieces of legislation. One, the Homestead Act, which was adopted during the Civil War, 1862. And then this was followed up with the Dawes Act. So the latter part of this lesson is having conversations about who gets to enjoy the benefits of this modernization. And of course, there are people who are going to be left out. And as you could see from the political cartoon, it is primarily Native Americans, as well as Mexicans who do surrender a good portion of their territory in order to create the United States that we know and enjoy today. So the students have the primary sources. There's a great website, if you've never used before, called ourdocuments.gov, which is a clearinghouse of any landmark piece of legislation in our country's history. So we can go through the Dawes Act, the Homestead Act. You probably are seeing them on your end. We have the transcript, and the students would, for homework, or if you wanted to provide them with an ability in the previous class to review this in a teacher-led format, they have the chance to go through these documents and really make the most out of their meaning. Because, if you're just waiting to do this in a classroom setting, chances are you're probably going to miss out on the deeper meaning of what this legislation is referencing. Queuing up another version, or another landscape rather, in the game for kind of a closing piece here. So you notice I did have to load another save file for this game. And for a lot of these open world games, the idea of fast travel, or sometimes it's known as warping, isn't as accessible. So you have to get a little creative with pulling up these different landscapes in the most efficient manner possible. So while I get to where I'd like to be, it should be right through this clearing if you're watching the Twitch stream. There we go. I'll stop it here. Let's get back now to some more probing questions. So do you believe the Homestead and Dawes Act are more different or similar? So, kind of the classic compare contrast. What's the effect of these acts on Native American cultural beliefs and traditions? And why do you think white Americans viewed Native American Indians as such a threat? So again, there's a lot to this. It's a multi-part question. You can spend however much time you feel is appropriate on this. And because the students have the freedom to explore this at their own pace, it's on you to kind of highlight the comments that you believe are worth bringing up in that large group discussion. I often use a lot of turn-in talks as I develop these lessons. I mentioned small grouping. So you really want to give the students a chance to unpack this together rather than you guiding the conversation. Let the questions do the guiding. You provided them with the questions. You set the foundational tone for these lessons, but then it's on them to drive it in the direction that they feel is most appropriate. Another piece of primary source documents that might be appropriate for this discussion was a pretty unique production by an individual by the name of Edward Curtis, a white American who was very interested in salvaging as much Native American culture as possible in this very transitional period. And so he put together what he called a musicale that he called A Vanishing Race. So if you're interested in reading more about Edward S. Curtis's work, I have a secondary source written by an individual independent scholar, and that should bring you to this page. And the conversation around white Americans taking an interest in Native culture, I think is something that is worth posing. Because we still are having these conversations 100 plus years later. So the beauty of a game like Red Dead Redemption, turning back to the Switch stream now, is you can see what a Native American reservation looked like during this period. You can interact with the landscape. You can interact with the individuals. If you were to play the game in the story mode, the narrative is very much driven by conversations around disenfranchisement. And so, if you were to go to this region of the country today, chances are all of this would probably be wiped from history. And so, going back to my point about these virtual environments, it creates the ability for educators to have discussions that they might not be able to have in reality or using other GIS, geographic information systems like a Google Earth type of software. It's just simply not around anymore. So that's why I feel like this approach is creating the means for discussion that other forms of media simply would struggle to recreate. Perhaps a film to a lesser extent, but the difference between a film and a game is that a film is static. A film will never change. You could watch it 10 times and it's always going to be the same actors, the same plot, the same dialogue. It might mean something different to you over the course of your life. It might resonate with you emotionally in a different way. But the idea of the game, of this virtual environment, is that every single time you pick up that controller and every single time you structure these conversations, they're going to be different and they're going to be meaningful for students. So that takes us to another guiding question here based on the landscape and the view of Edward Curtis and others, as well as these principal pieces of legislation, the Dawes and the Homestead Act. What were the Native Americans' options after the passing of the Dawes Act? What do you think these events might have, what effect do you think these events might have had on American citizens around the country? So not only are we looking at the Native American point of view, but also what would the point of view be of the white American 1898 time period after these landmark pieces of legislation. So I think it's important to have these conversations, right? And to move outside of that traditional national narrative, if you will, and consider as many viewpoints as possible. The lesson comes to a closure in a small group activity format. This particular week, I wanted the students to take on the role of members of the U.S. Department of the Interior. If you don't know what they do, that is the federal agency responsible for the conservation of the nation's land, as well as the managing of its resources. And it also oversees Native American relations. So the Division of Indian Affairs, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, I should say, fell under the purview of the Department of the Interior and still does. The year is 1900, as it is in the game, 1898 roughly. And you and your team are instructed to outline by way of Google Doc or Google Slides or whatever format they want to use that puts together the policy goals of the U.S. Department of Interior for the next decade. Now, this is based off of all the discussions that we've had. It's based off the primary source legislation that we looked at, the Homestead Act, the Dawes Act, and they need to put themselves in the mindset of an individual who would be on this committee in order to outline the mission, the official stance of the United States in this time period. So some guiding questions that they would develop in their mission statement or objectives. What is our country's relationship to the land? How do you define our stewardship of the environment? How do you maintain a positive rapport with all these Native American tribes? How will you account for rapidly changing technological advancements? All of this would have to be addressed in their simulated policy statement, I guess we'll say, from the perspective of someone serving on the Department of the Interior. And perhaps they would want to take the role of someone with a more progressive or liberal stance. It doesn't necessarily have to follow the historical details. That's the beauty of these small group discussions, in that, yes, they're considering what it would have been like to be in the mindset of an individual from this era, but they're also taking their current perspective into consideration and maybe adapting the official position of the country. So there is kind of that element of an alternate or an alternative history that is possible through these different activities. And to me, you know, this is the stuff that really gets me excited about teaching these social studies concepts, because the students are in the driver's seat and the students are using all of this background knowledge, all of these conversations we've had leading up to this point in order to develop a well thought out, meaningful example of a government policy. So, you know, it's another form of those, I guess, paper-based simulations that I alluded to early on in my presentation. But the difference is it's being fueled through the lens of the secondary source, which is the video game. And then as a closure to this lesson and all my lessons, I like to ask for feedback from the students. So what did you particularly enjoy about the lesson? What would you have changed about the lesson? And then lastly, as you reflect on this experience, what about the primary source imagery and text do you see represented within the game? And try to be as detailed as possible. So they're making those connections between the primary source and the secondary source. And I will go to my grave arguing for the fact that a video game like Red Dead Redemption or the other ones that I highlighted in this presentation is just as valid and just as valuable, if not more so, as a secondary source than film, songs, and the like. So I will end my presentation there, just so I am staying on time and giving you all an opportunity to share your thoughts, questions, comments. Like I said, I'm happy to make any of this available for you. And I'm genuinely interested in having a conversation around these ideas. So I thank you for your focus and your continued dedication to your students. And maybe there was a piece of this that you can adopt. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming in and having this presentation for us. On behalf of everyone, on behalf of KDP, we wish you nothing but success, and we really appreciate you coming in and presenting for us.
Happy to do it, Christy. And I would like to be more active in KDP myself, so perhaps you'll be seeing even more of me.
Yes. And we can definitely reach out to you too.
Great. Finally having a chance to go through the chat here. So thank you all for your input. I'm glad you enjoyed the simulations. And yeah, the students, at least speaking from my somewhat biased group of gamers, they really do enjoy these types of experiences, and they can be really wonderful teaching tools. But the key is the prep work. So there's a lot that goes into this on the student and also the teacher end. You really have to be competent in these games. You have to understand the controls and the maps and limit any potential distractions or inappropriate behavior, because the games that I selected, as I'm sure many of you know, do have mature ratings. So you have to ensure that they're being used purely for educational purposes. Okay, I guess, Christy, I'll leave it there if there's nothing else. And then, I know we're doing our kind of recap here in a few moments to close out the conference. So
yeah, we are just going to do the closing session.
Yeah.
And then we are all wrapped up.
Great. Well, I'll look out. Maybe, if you want to email me, I'll put my email once again in the chat. And I'm sure it's probably available on the Mount website. But, if you want to reach out to me for anything, this was just kind of a speed run through this lesson. I was trying to, sort of set the tone, but there's a lot more to this. And so if you're interested in kind of the nuts and bolts that goes into creating one of these lessons, I'm happy to share those with you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, no problem at all. I guess I'll turn off my camera. No sense in kind of having an awkward silence here. So
yeah, we can go back to the main room whenever you guys feel free.
Great. All right. Thank you again, everybody.